Hello again, friends, and welcome back to the Soul Unleashed podcast. So today I want to talk about something called the soul groups. And this is an unscripted podcast. Normally, I at least write out bullet points about what I want to talk about. But I kind of want to set the stage for a future group of podcasts. I want to do this in a series of maybe 3 or 4 podcasts. But soul groups, what are they? How they work, and my understanding so far. I'll start out by saying right off the bat that I am not an expert on any of this, nor am I going to recommend that you believe one thing or another, because I'm still learning. But part of this journey is sharing with you as I'm learning these kind of things. And it's usually stuff that I always thought was completely crazy or Fruit Loop kind of stuff, right? So I want to start first with my initial concept of what happens when we die. And as I was growing up, grew up as a Catholic. I've told this story a number of times in other podcasts, but I grew up in a very strict environment, understanding how things work. Catholic grade school, Catholic high school. It was a lot of fun. It was a lot of fun, but I came to an understanding of how things work within the Catholic tradition. And that basically is that when you die, first of all, there's no such thing as reincarnation. You have one shot at life on earth, and then when you die, your soul goes to be judged initially, and then you're sent to either purgatory or hell. In some cases, very rare cases, if you're already purified or if you die as a saint or as a martyr, you may be already pure enough to go to heaven and join God. But for most of us lowly types, we go to purgatory and we spend time there. I have a whole thing about purgatory, about how it's supposed to work, but basically you get purified through the process of purgatory, and then you go to heaven. That's kind of the way it's supposed to work, but you only get one shot. And so I used to wonder a lot of times about what happens with babies. I've known babies that have died, what happens with them, and we're taught that babies go to a place called limbo if they're not baptized, and they spend time there in eternity until the final judgment, and then they join God. None of that seemed quite understandable or even fair to me, but that's where babies are supposed to go. And then, of course, I never understood the death of small children. If you only have one shot at this, that's it. Why did people come in to this environment, to Earth, to live just a short period of time? And it was always described to me as God's plan being mysterious, certainly not something we could understand. And there was a reason why little children would die at such an early age, especially when I read things about like the Holocaust and the death of children there. And now throughout the world, children dying in all kinds of wars. What is God's plan for that? So that's where I was prior to my soul awakening thing. And I just believed that it was all part of the mystery of God's creation. So then this concept, I went through the process where we lost our son, and I was motivated by trying to understand if he was okay. Certainly grief played a large part in this. Any of you who've lost children can understand this. But you want to know if your child is safe or happy. And the same thing happens if you lose parents, right? I lost both my parents, my wife's parents, other relatives have passed. But that was all kind of part of God's plan, right? I understood that that's the way things were supposed to work, and especially for parents, that they kind of predecease you, and it's just a great circle of life. When children die, however, and you lose a child, you question a lot more. I did. Questioned a lot more about God's mysterious plan and why God would allow that to happen, and why the prayers that we offered for our son were not answered, and he still died. That led me to want to investigate and to read. Also, part of this whole experience, the Soul Unleashed, involves what we start seeing and what I call orbs. So these floating sources of energy that appeared to be something that was paranormal or supernatural. I'm an engineer by trade, by background, project manager, military. My whole life was about being black and white and questioning and evaluating things according to logic or science, right? So when I saw the orbs, they started about 2 or 3 months after our son passed. I initially started investigating them, trying different cameras. I was seeing them on cameras, security cameras. They completely surprised me and changed everything, honestly, because I understood and felt right away that they were from our son. But I tried different things, different cameras, different places, different rooms, different phones, and continued to validate that this phenomena that we were seeing was something that was unusual and that was not dust or insects or uh, flying bugs or something. I don't know. There's a lot of different things that people say orbs can be, and I can understand that, especially when you take pictures of orbs and sometimes you get sunlight or raindrops or whatever. But these were videos that we were seeing. And I went and spoke to priests in the Catholic Church and at Georgetown University and a Catholic University. And I wanted to know what the church thought about orbs and found very little help there other than the offer of an exorcist. So that was my experience that got me to reading about books like mediums, and eventually led me to the concept of soul groups. So my understanding right now what a soul group is first of all, it involves reincarnation, and that you come back to this life more than one time. This, to me, I find very hopeful, exciting, reassuring that we're able to come back time and time and time again and incarnate in this earth and learn more lessons and become better souls or more purified souls, go back to spirit, learn and review our lesson, and then come back again to do it again. Now, there's tons of books written about this, and there's not any one single theory as far as what happens when we go through this. But some recent books that I've read and earlier books about Journey of Souls and Dr. Brian Weiss, Dr. Michael Newton, they've written books about this. And I've also read a lot of things by the Seth material, Abraham Hicks material, just a lot of books that I've read. And of course, I've talked to my many friends. I have many friends who are strict biblical Christians, and all this is nonsense. And I appreciate that, and I respect that. And I always try to look at this with an open mind, open from the perspective of, I understand what the Bible says about this, but I also understand what my personal feelings are and what I'm reading and what I believe. There's a quote by Francis Bacon, which I just read in another recent book I'm reading. This book is quite the book, but what is their meaning in this text? There's a really good friend I have who suggested, he watches these podcasts, and my friend and I have known each other since we were 18 years old. He's a very wonderful, devout Christian. I really respect him and his biblical knowledge. And so sometimes I say things on these podcasts that come across as not aligning with his beliefs. And he recommended someone else listen to it. And that person recommended that I read this book, which is basically a book about reading the Bible and getting meaning from the Bible. And actually, I'm only 2 chapters in. It's quite the slog for me. I have to read like each page twice to understand it. But I'm going through it, and that's because I want to understand a different perspective about the Bible. I just don't want to jump on the train that says the Bible is just a bunch of stories written by men, and men put it together, and it may or may not be true. So I'm trying to better understand the Christian perspective on that. However, what just led me off down that rabbit hole is there's a quote in here by Sir Francis Bacon, and Bacon wrote that we subscribe or ascribe meaning to a text based upon our own personal belief and how we want things to be. So sometimes we'll read things or we'll believe things because it's how we want things to be. Bacon says this in much more beautiful text and much smarter words than I'm using, but that resonated with me because I know that I'm reading some things, especially when it comes to souls and soul groups and reincarnation. I'm reading things and I'm agreeing with them because I want it to be true. So now I'm on guard against thinking automatically about those things. But back to soul groups and how they're supposed to work. So a soul group is a collection of souls, other entities, souls, that you experience these lives with over and over again. So, for example, in this life, I have a wife, I have children, I have grandchildren, I have parents, and that group of souls would be the same group that eventually, when we all die and our spirits return to spirit, we start planning again for another return to Earth to experience it again. I've mentioned I've mentioned a couple times. I'm laughing because my system here automatically interprets my hand gestures. Uh, so you don't always return maybe with the same group. Is what's kind of confusing for me. I don't know how this really works, but I mentioned before that in one of the sessions with the medium, my son came through. My son who's passed, and he mentioned that he and I had been together in other lives in different relationships. So in this life, in this current life I'm living, I was the father. He was my son. He made it clear through this medium that in a previous life, he and I were brothers riding with Teddy Roosevelt and the Rough Riders. It's easy to say that now, but the way that came across was very difficult. The medium who was explaining this didn't know what she was describing, and eventually we narrowed it down to the Rough Riders. And in a life before that, we were together. I don't know what our relationship was, but it was during the Civil Revolutionary War, in the United States. So that would have been 1700s, 75, 76. And then prior to that, and he was joking about this in an attempt to show me that our souls are sexless. But sometime in the 15th century, I was a Spanish dancer, a woman in a red dress, and he was excited or hot for me. So that was kind of funny. But the point is that he and I have returned many times to live different lives. Is that possible? I don't know. I'm reading an interesting book right now by Dr. Michael Newton, Journey of Souls, which goes through a lot of case studies where people under hypnosis go back and relive or describe certain lives. Now, if that was to happen with one or two people, you could write that off as a mental illness or just dreaming or something. But he's got thousands of case studies, and what he's finding are consistencies in terms of what people say they're experiencing when they're going through this process. I've mentioned before in another podcast that I've gone through a past life regression with someone else. That didn't quite go as I expected, or wasn't quite as successful as I thought. And I'm anxious to do it again, to go through it. It was just not as the experience wasn't what I thought it was going to be. I thought I was going to be kind of under hypnosis, but I was fully aware of what was going on, and also aware that I was saying stuff and I knew where it was coming from. So half my brain was saying, "What are you talking about?" And the other half was explaining that I was some type of peasant in 17th century or 16th century France. Anyway, that was that's the concept of soul groups. Now, I have challenges with this because my parents, for example, they have their own soul group, right? How's it possible that they're part of my soul group and yet they've got their own parents and their own grandparents? Who do you decide to come back with? So I'm beginning to learn a little bit about the limits of soul groups. Are they circles that kind of overlap and some souls come back and some souls don't? These are just questions that I have. Again, I'm thinking like an analytical type person, but how does that work? Who do you decide to come back with? Assuming you believe that any of this is true, right? None of this obviously is in the Bible. Jesus says nothing about this. But there's a lot of things that we believe that Jesus says nothing about, including purgatory, for example. So, and this also ties into what happens after we die. So when we die, according to the soul group theory, we go through a period of reflection and recovery. And what Dr. Newton says in his book is, through all these thousands of case studies that he's been through, there is no indication that there is any type of eternal fire, damnation, brimstone, the classic Christian understanding of what happens if you get condemned to hell. I've always been kind of looking for that, not only with Newton, but other books I've read, and there's no mention of hell. There is a mention of that we go through some period of recovery or reinstruction, particularly if you do things that are considered evil here on earth. So people who commit evil acts, what happens to them? I've always thought, obviously, that somebody who does evil, especially, Hitler's the primary example, but there's plenty of examples of people that commit rape or murder or seriously damage and hurt somebody here on earth. Sometimes all we have is the assurance that that person's going to go to hell. And so that provides some measure of comfort to the survivors or the surviving family members. If it's hard, I think, to believe, if you're a surviving family member, to believe that that person's going to die and that soul is not going to go to hell, but go to some place where it's going to rest and recover and probably come back to earth again, that's a difficult pill to swallow. I don't know if I could do that if I was grievously harmed by somebody. I would take comfort in the fact that that person's going to go to hell. But everything I've read so far indicates that it doesn't happen, that you go someplace and your soul is fixed or healed. Sometimes it takes a long time. It's a long process. Maybe that's a definition of hell in this, or purgatory, in the sense that your soul's in this place where it has to heal and recover before it can come back. But Newton has a whole bunch of different descriptions about what happens and how your guides kind of take you through that process when you die. So that's kind of just an introduction to the concept of soul groups. I'm going to continue to talk about this and to read more, and I'll do a little bit more scholarly podcast in a little bit that mentions more resources and things that you can study or go to if you're interested in this kind of thing. And again, for my friends out there that think this is all, woo-woo and nut job stuff, I get it, okay? Because I always thought that way too. I mean, I never considered this. In fact, I thought reincarnation was when you came back as a bug or something, or a bird. But now my understanding is, and I'm really open to this idea, is that we come back again and again as in human form to improve ourselves and to work on specific things, with the ultimate aim being perfection, or getting to the point where you can be in the presence of God. So that is the podcast for today and the thoughts for today. And I will follow this up later with a more comprehensive look at some specific points that deal with soul groups. Thanks. Bye-bye.